Sweater knitting is addictive, and after you've knit a sweater or two that fits you really well, you're going to be going down that rabbit hole of exploring all the different sweater constructions. And then you'll probably discover that you can knit a sweater without following somebody else's written pattern. There's only a couple things you need: tape measure to take your body measurements, and a swatch of different needle sizes so you can choose the right fabric for your sweater. That process is called self-drafting a sweater, and we're going to break it down into 5 simple steps in this video. Hey Nerdy Knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and I'm here to help you knit garments that fit so you can knit and wear them confidently, knowing that you created something that is perfectly suited to your body. Now, if you've ever thought about skipping the pattern and just self-drafting a sweater, I'm here to tell you that that process is actually pretty simple. If you have your body measurements and you've knit a swatch and you can take measurements from your swatch, you have all you need to create a sweater that's perfect for your body. So we're going to walk through this whole process. There's actually 5 steps in the process, and we're going to go through each one of them sort of like a big overhead view of what you would need to do this. Now, you're going to need a tape measure because you want to take some body measurements. You're going to need the yarn and needles that you'd like to use for the sweater, and I like to test a few needle sizes to make sure I'm choosing a fabric that I really like, and I do one big swatch with all those needle sizes, so I'm going to show you exactly how I do that. Then you're also going to want some paper that you can draw on, a pen or a pencil, and a calculator, and then a ruler as well. So once you've gathered all your supplies, you can dive right into this 5-step process. Now, the first step is actually choosing what sweater construction method you would like to follow. Now, there are drop shoulder sweaters, there's raglan sweaters, there's circular yoke sweaters, there's set in sleeve, there's saddle shoulders. There's lots of ways to knit a sweater, so you have to pick the construction method that you want to do first. Then you have to decide, is it going to be top down, bottom up, all of those details, like which method, is it going to be knit flat, in the round? You have to make that choice. So for our example, I'm going to go with a basic sweater, a drop shoulder sweater that is knit flat in pieces. Here are a few examples of some drop shoulder sweaters. This is the most basic version. It's basically just a big rectangle. You would like knit starting at the hem, up to the armhole, stop and put some markers so you know where your armhole is going to be, and then knit to the top, maybe do some shoulder shaping and some neckline shaping for the back neck or the front neck, and then of course the sleeves in the same way. Or you could do a modified drop shoulder, which has you bind off some stitches for the armhole. It helps get rid of some of that excess fabric that you can have in a drop shoulder. So this is my example. I'm going to be knitting a drop shoulder sweater. I'm actually going to be teaching a class on this, but more about that later. So you need to decide which sweater construction you want to use, whether it's going to be done flat, in the round, top down, bottom up. You need to decide that first. So when you're swatching, you'll be able to judge the fabric based on the type of construction you'd like to do. Because some sweaters, like a top-down circular yoke or raglan that has no seams, requires a slightly firmer fabric to keep it all in place, where something that has seams, like a drop shoulder sweater that's knit in pieces, you can go with a little more flowy and loose fabric if you want to, knowing that those seams are going to provide some structure. Now, the next step in the process, once you've chosen your construction method, is to take body measurements, add some ease, turn that into a schematic. Like that picture I just showed you, you could draw one out on paper of like what the sweater is supposed to look like. But then once you know what that construction is, that's when you can decide which body measurements will be most important for that sweater. Different types of sweaters have different types of body measurements that are most important. For example, with a drop shoulder sweater, 2 of the most important measurements are the full bust measurement and the bicep measurement, because you need those 2 to decide where that sleeve for that drop shoulder is going to land on your arm, because it doesn't sit up where your shoulder is naturally. On a drop shoulder sweater, that seam is sitting down somewhere on your bicep. It could be way down by your elbow, could be maybe close to your shoulder, but somewhere in there is where that sweater is going to fall. So that measurement is very important. That actually dictates the armhole depth that you'll need for your sweater. Then of course you need your bust circumference to make sure the sweater is going to be large enough, and then you want to know from like the top of your neck down to the where you want the sweater to end, all of those measurements. If you're not quite sure about this part in the process, I recommend you check out the Craft Yarn Council. They have a page dedicated to just taking body measurements, and most of the measurements there you'll need for most of the sweaters that you're planning to knit. So that's a really good place to start with body measurements. Now, once you have your body measurements, you're going to add some ease to some of them, not all of them. You don't need to add any ease to the length, like the length of your sweater or the length of your sleeve, nothing like that. But if it's a circumference, you probably need to add some ease. So your bust measurement plus a couple of inches of ease, your bicep measurement and a couple inches of ease, you need to know that. So all of those body measurements, add a little bit of ease to the circumferences, especially the bust and the bicep, and then you can take that and add that to your schematic. So you'll have your drawing that you've drawn out on paper, and you can start adding those measurements on there, like how wide do you want your sweater to be, how long do you want it to be, how wide do you want the sleeve cuff to be, or the top of the sleeve. All of those numbers, you're going to add them to your schematic. Now for that drop shoulder example, here's a list of the basic measurements I know I need for this sweater. I need my upper arm measurement, the point at where that sweater is going to fall on my arm, the circumference at the full bust, the length of the sweater from the back neck to the hem, my sleeve length, whether it's going to be a 3/4 sleeve or a wrist length sleeve, I need to know that, and also my neck width. And of those measurements, there's 3 that are going to require additional ease to make sure the sweater is fitting you well. And by ease, I mean positive ease. A drop shoulder sweater has to be larger than your body to actually fit it. So you're going to need some positive ease at the full bust, at the arm point where that sweater sleeve is going to sit, and then also at the wrist. A couple inches is pretty generally good at the wrist. You can decide on the rest for the body, whether you want very oversized or more closely fitted. The Craft Yarn Council is another good place to start. They have some recommendations for like the amount of ease depending on the type of fit you want. So I'll have a link down below for that. Then once I have those measurements and I know exactly what I want, I'm going to translate that to my schematic so I know what size the sweater is going to be. So this drawing of the schematic here is not my body measurements, it's what I want for my finished sweater, whatever the sleeve length is, whatever like the neckline opening, how wide I need that to be, how long do I want my sweater, how wide do I want it to be, how much is the armhole depth going to be, all of that stuff. I'm going to be writing that on here using my body measurements and that desired amount of ease. Then once you have that schematic and you've got those measurements, it's time to start swatching. So when it comes to swatching, I like to make a big swatch. On this one, I did 4 different needle sizes, but that, I know it's a lot, but instead of doing one needle size, doing all of the swatching, blocking it, realizing you don't like the fabric, why repeat that? Then you have to repeat that whole process however many number of times. So I do, on this example, 4 different needle sizes. I generally do about 3. So here it is a little closer. So I start with 1 needle size, and then when I'm ready to switch to the next needle size, I grab the new needle and I just knit across on the wrong side row to get this little line separating them. Then I do a little section of yarn over, so I know that this section was on US 4 needles, and then I can repeat that for as many needle sizes as I want. And then I can look at my swatch. So this one has been blocked, but I would look at it before it's been washed and blocked. And I would look at the fabric and see which one I like in its natural state before it's washed. I'm going to take my pre-block measurements. I'm going to get a ruler. I'm going to be measuring the whole width of this, minus a couple stitches at each side, just to check my gauge, and then do a couple more gauge measurements in there to get a good average to make sure I know what the gauge is. I'm going to repeat that for each section. Then I'm going to look at the fabric, and I want, specifically for this drop shoulder, I want something that has a nice good bit of drape to it. So I'm going to look at each section and feel it and see, do I like the drape of this one? I find that this one on the bottom is a little more firm than I want for this sweater. And this one at the top is a little too loose. When I look at that and I know I can almost sort of poke my fingernail through there, that's probably a little more loose than I really want. So I might focus on these 2 needle sizes here, my US 4 and US 5, and look at these 2 fabrics, take their gauge measurements, play around with them, see if I like the drape. Can I poke my needle? I can kind of poke my fingernail through the 5 as well. But I like the drape of the 5, so I'll have to decide if I like that one enough, or do I like the US 4. I have to decide which fabric I prefer. And then once I've chosen that, then that's the gauge, the information that I want to focus on. And I'm going to take the gauge measurements again for that size. So I have the pre-block measurements and the post-block measurements. And when I talk about blocking, I'm not talking about I am talking about washing your swatch and then laying it flat to dry. I didn't even pin this one out. I kind of uncurled it and kind of pushed them down so the edges wouldn't curl up. I didn't stretch it in any way. All I mean by washing and blocking is getting your swatch wet, letting it dry in a natural state. If it was lace, I probably would stretch it out so it would open up the lace. But I don't want to stretch out this sweater, so I'm going to treat the swatch exactly like I'm going to treat my sweater. I'm going to be hand washing my sweater, and I'm going to be laying it flat to dry. So that's exactly what I'm going to do with my swatch as well. So a couple more guidelines when it comes to swatching. Use the yarn that you're going to use for your sweater. Use the needles that you're going to use for the sweater. Not the same size needles. You might have like wooden needles and metal needles and a whole bunch that are all sort of maybe like a US 4 like mine. I want you to use the actual needles that you think you're going to knit the sweater with, because that's going to give you the most accurate measurement. You're going to take your gauge measurements before you wash and block that swatch, and then you're going to take them again after. Those pre-block measurements are actually really important because you can use those numbers to guide your knitting. So as you're knitting your sweater, you can check your gauge and see if it matches that pre-block measurement. Your swatch could change a lot in size before and after washing, and you need to know that in the swatch before you actually knit the sweater. So if you have a swatch that suddenly grew a ½ an inch, you need to know that. So you need to take that pre-block measurement and compare it with the post-block measurement as well. I have a whole video on the swatching process, so I'll be sure to link that down below, and if you want to go into a little more detail about that. We've got 2 more steps in this process to work through, but before we do that, I just want to introduce you to my course, the Swatch to Sweater program. We are focusing on a drop shoulder sweater knit in pieces from the bottom up. So if you want to go through this process that we're talking about today, all of these steps, we're going to go through this together in this workshop. We're going to have live coaching sessions on Zoom over 9 weeks and a lot of other bonus things going on. And I'm actually going to be knitting a sweater as well and walking you through the process when I do it so you can see exactly how it's done. So if you're interested in learning more about that workshop, you'll find a link for it down below. So here is the major step of this process where you're going to take your schematic with your measurements and create another schematic with your stitch and row counts. And a lot of people actually just knit straight from this schematic. So it's definitely a possibility. You don't need to write out a whole pattern. You can put everything on one page with your stitch and row counts and follow that. So you've got your schematic with the measurements. You're going to draw out another drawing of the sweater without those measurements. This is where you're going to add your stitch and row numbers. So this is where your gauge information is important. So after you've washed and blocked that swatch, you've let it dry, you've handled it a bit so it's like in a really good natural state, you're going to take the measurements of that, the section that you like the most, and you're going to convert that to 1 inch stitch and row gauge. You're not going to measure 1 inch, you're going to measure the biggest area you can and then divide that. Let's say that measurement is 6 inches wide. You're going to know the number of stitches in that 6-inch section. You're going to divide it by 6, and that's going to give you a stitch count for 1 inch. So you'll know how many stitches you need for 1 inch of fabric, and rows as well. You'll do the same thing for your rows. So then you can take the schematic with your measurements and then multiply by your stitch and row gauges to make your new schematic, which is going to have those stitch and row counts. So for all of the horizontal measurements, you're going to need stitch counts. For all of your vertical measurements, you're going to need row counts. So let's say that your drop shoulder sweater, you want it to be 25 inches across the front, and your 1 inch stitch gauge is 5 inches. You're going to multiply 25 by 5, and that's going to give you a number. It's going to give you 125. So that's how many stitches you need for the front of your sweater. Probably the back is the same. So you want 125 stitches to knit the desired width of your sweater. Now let's say you want a sweater that is 18 inches from the bottom to your underarm. So we have the length, we know we want it to be 18 inches, but this is a length measurement. So we need to know how many rows it's going to take to get that length. Let's say that your 1 inch row gauge is 7 inches or 7 stitches. So you're going to multiply that 18 inch length by that 7 stitch gauge for 1 inch, and that's going to give you a row count of 126. So now you know 2 big things. You know the number of stitches you need for the width, 125. You're going to have to knit that for 126 rows to get the length that you want. So you're going to repeat this process for every part of that schematic you've created. The width that you want, the length that you want to the armhole, and then from the armhole to the shoulder, the sleeves, everything like that. You're going to write down those stitch counts. The sleeves, the stitch count you want at the wrist, the stitch count that you want at the top. You need to have all of those stitch counts written down. That's a major process. So it's going to take you a few minutes to get all of those stitch counts and row counts written on your new schematic. Now, the last part of this is probably the most confusing for people. It's how do you get from one stitch count to another? For example, on that sleeve, you probably have very few stitches at the wrist, but you need a whole lot at the bicep. That's what is called your shaping rate. That's what you need to figure out. You need to know how many stitches you're starting with, how many stitches you're ending with, and then you want to convert that. So you're going to subtract one from the other, and that's telling you, for a sleeve example, how many stitches you need to increase. And then I know that I want to increase 2 stitches on every time I increase. I'm going to be increasing on each end of that sleeve. So I can take that number and divide it by 2, and that will tell me how many times I need to do this increasing. And of course, I want to spread it out. So once I know how long my sleeve is and that's converted to rows, I can now divide the number of rows by the number of shaping rows I want to do. And that gives me a number, probably with a decimal point place in there, but you can at least get an idea of how many rows you're going to work plain between each of those increases. So you might have to do an increase round and then row and then work 4 rows, etc., etc. But there are different online calculators you can use to help you figure this out. And after you've done it a time or two, it does get much easier. But this last part of the process is probably the most math intensive. But once you've done this, that's your whole sweater. Like, you have just written it all right on one piece of paper, all your stitch and row counts, and then all of your shaping rates that you need for each part of that sweater. So the last thing you're going to want to do is cast on. You have everything you need on that one piece of paper. You don't need a whole pattern printed out. Of course, if you want to do something interesting like add some cables or lace or whatever stitch pattern you want to do, you're going to want to swatch those as well and make sure you have the gauge information for that, and you're going to add that to your schematic wherever it's going to fit in there. So that's just really a high level overview of the whole process, but it really just does come down to that. If you have a swatch and you have your body measurements, you can turn that into a sweater. That's exactly what every designer does. You have to start with a sample size. Generally, it's going to be your own body or a mannequin or something, and some measurements, and you have your swatch and you figure all of this out, and that's how you knit a design. And of course, there's other steps to get that pattern ready for lots of different sizes, but you can do the same process for your sweater. Now, if you're intrigued by this process, but you need a little more help to get through it than just this video has provided, then be sure to check out this Swatch to Sweater class. We're going to take 9 weeks of weekly group coaching sessions where I will coach you through this whole process, and you can watch me do the whole thing with you as well. I've got my swatch here, and I'm making my schematic right now so I can show you exactly how it's done so you can create your own sweater. Now, if you want to just hang out with me and watch some more sweater knitting videos, I have a short playlist right here that dives into more topics on sweater knitting. So click right there and I'll see you in the next video.